Wind River Valley, Wyoming. January 1839. The temperature fell to 30 degrees below zero. Snow buried the paths. Inside every cabin along the creek, smoke filled the rooms as fires sputtered against the cold, pouring through poorly sealed walls and stone chimneys built against outer logs. Trappers burned cord after cord of wood, yet frost still crept across interior walls by dawn. Inside one cabin, smoke rose cleanly from a split-flue chimney, an odd, bent design the neighbors had ridiculed for 2 years. The fire burned steady. The cabin stayed warm. By morning, embers still glowed. The firewood pile, once depleted by February, now lasted through March. Jonas Fletcher's unconventional chimney, mocked as wasteful complexity, had cut fuel consumption by half. Within 3 years, variations of his design would appear in cabins across the Rockies, while those who refused to adapt continued their endless battle against smoke and cold. The math would decide who stayed and who left. Inside Jonas Fletcher's cabin, frost climbed the interior walls despite the fire roaring in the stone hearth. Ice formed on the inside of the window by midnight. The cold was inescapable. Fletcher had built the structure using methods every trapper in the Rockies used. Logs stacked horizontal, notched at corners. Clay mixed with moss packed between gaps. Stone fireplace positioned on the north wall where the ground was flattest. 3 weeks of work completed in late September. It looked adequate. By December, the inadequacy was obvious. The fireplace radiated half its heat directly into the outer wall, conducting warmth straight outside. The unseasoned logs, cut in late summer, shrank as they dried. Gaps opened. Clay chinking cracked during the first hard freeze, then crumbled away. Wind found every weakness. Fletcher was from Virginia. He had worked as a carpenter's apprentice before joining a trapping brigade heading west in 1833. He knew timber frames and board construction, but not log cabins, not mountain winters. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero in January. Fletcher kept the fire burning day and night. He burned 4 cords of wood that month, 3 times what it should have taken. His hands stayed raw from splitting logs. His back ached from hauling them. Still, the cold seeped through walls like they were made of paper. Worse, the smoke. The chimney draft was inconsistent. Cold air pushing down from above mixed with hot air rising from below, creating turbulence. Smoke backed into the cabin, stinging eyes, coating everything with soot. Fletcher woke each morning coughing. By February, he had burned through more firewood than any 3 men should need for a winter. His woodpile, which should have lasted until April, was nearly gone. He spent every 3rd day cutting and hauling more wood, time stolen from checking trap lines, processing pelts, or simply resting. When spring finally arrived in April, the valley warmed. The thick log walls that couldn't hold warmth in winter somehow trapped every bit of summer heat. The cabin became an oven. Sleep was impossible. Fletcher spent summer nights outside on the ground. He wasn't alone in this problem. Every trapper along the creek faced the same brutal reality. The standard cabin design that worked reasonably well in eastern forests became nearly unlivable in the extreme temperature swings of the high country. Summer days hit 90 degrees. Winter nights dropped to 30 below. The same structure had to handle both. Fletcher sat outside his cabin in June, watching the sun set over the valley walls. He thought about the coming winter. Another season like the last would break him. He was burning through resources faster than he could replace them. Something had to change. He didn't know it yet, but the answer would come from 2 sources: a Swedish trapper who understood heat flow, and a Shoshone woman who thought white men built ridiculous houses. The late autumn air carried the scent of pine and cold earth. Fletcher sat near his fireplace, watching frost form on the interior walls even as he stoked the fire. He was preparing for another winter, knowing he couldn't endure another year like the last. In October, a Swedish trapper named Niels Bergström stopped at Fletcher's cabin while passing through the valley. Bergström had been in the mountains since the early 1820s, one of the old-timers who had seen everything and survived it all. He looked at Fletcher's cabin with practiced eyes, studied the fireplace position, checked the chinking, examined how the logs had settled. "You are cold here?" Bergström said. It wasn't a question. Fletcher didn't deny it. "Colder than I've ever been. Can't figure why. Logs are tight, mostly. Got a good fireplace." Bergström walked around the structure. He pushed on logs, noted the gaps. Finally, he shook his head. "Your cabin is built backwards. You have made the fire warm the ground outside instead of the floor inside. The cold lives in your walls instead of staying where it belongs, outside." Fletcher had no idea what that meant. Bergström explained in the straightforward way of someone who had figured these principles through hard experience. Heat moved in specific ways. It radiated from hot surfaces like fire or sun-warmed stone. It conducted through materials, faster through some than others. It rose, which was why the ceiling area of any cabin stayed warmer than the floor. The problem with Fletcher's cabin was that every one of these heat movements worked against him. The fireplace radiated half its warmth to the exterior wall, which conducted that heat straight outside. The rising heat escaped through gaps near the roofline that Fletcher hadn't sealed properly. The log walls, which seemed solid, actually acted as moderate conductors, not terrible insulators, but not good ones either. And the cabin had no thermal mass inside to hold warmth after the fire died. Down. "In the old country," Bergström said, "we learned long ago how to keep warm. You build the heat storage inside the house, not outside. The fireplace must be in the center or at least not touching the outer walls. The mass of stone must be surrounded by warm air so it holds that warmth and gives it back slowly through the night." He explained that the best cabins in the Rockies were built by trappers who had learned from mistakes, usually after suffering through multiple winters. They positioned fireplaces in the interior when possible, or at least built them with significant mass extending into the living space. They sealed every gap with proper chinking materials that wouldn't crack or fall out. Fletcher listened carefully. He had already started planning a second cabin to be built before next winter arrived. Everything Bergström told him contradicted the standard wisdom he had followed before. But that standard wisdom had left him freezing and miserable. He decided to try something different. That same autumn, a Shoshone woman named Morning Crow came through the valley with her husband, Baptiste Marot, a French-Canadian trapper. They stopped at Fletcher's cabin to trade. Morning Crow took one look at his setup and laughed. "White men build cold houses," she said, in the mixture of Shoshone, French, and English that served as common language in the mountain trade. "You make walls that breathe out warmth like old man breathes out life." Fletcher was getting tired of people telling him his cabin was terrible, but he was smart enough to listen when someone who had survived winters in this country had advice to offer. Morning Crow explained that her people didn't build with logs the way white trappers did. When they made structures meant to last through winter, they used what she called two skins, an inner wall and an outer wall with air or insulating material trapped between them. The principle was simple. Air itself was actually a reasonable insulator as long as it didn't move. Trap air between two barriers and it couldn't carry heat away. But if you just had a single log wall, the air on both sides of it was in direct contact with the wood, allowing heat to transfer through constantly. Add a second barrier with trapped air between, and you dramatically reduced that heat transfer. Morning Crow described how her people used bark, hides, or woven mats to create double-layer shelters. She explained how they dug lodges partially underground in the coldest regions, using the earth itself as insulation. She mentioned something Fletcher hadn't considered, that a structure could be designed to work with the seasons, staying warm in winter and cool in summer if you understood how the sun moved and how air flowed. "In summer," she said, You want the hot air to leave. Make openings high where the hot air goes. Make shade on the sunny side. In winter, you close the high openings. Make the hot air stay inside, and you keep the earth warmth beneath. Your floor, not let it go away, outside. Fletcher spent the rest of autumn and early winter thinking about everything Bergstrom and Morning Crow had told him. Heat moving in different ways, trapping air, positioning the fireplace where its warmth would stay inside instead of escaping, double walls and proper materials. By December, he had worked out a plan for a new cabin. He would rebuild from scratch, using everything he had learned. The construction would take most of the following summer, but it would be worth it to have a structure that actually worked with the mountain climate instead of fighting it. Fletcher started cutting logs in late fall of 1835, when the sap had retreated and the wood would season better. He cut twice as many logs as he would need for a standard cabin because his design called for double walls in critical areas. He let the logs sit through winter, stacked with spacers between them to allow air circulation. By spring, when most moisture had left the wood, he began construction. The first major change was the foundation and floor. Fletcher's original cabin had sat directly on the ground with a packed earth floor. The new design incorporated stone foundation piers at the corners and midpoints, raising the entire structure about 2 feet off the ground. This created a crawl space that served multiple purposes. It kept the bottom logs from ground moisture and rot. It provided a buffer of air between the cold earth and the living space, and it allowed Fletcher to store items that needed to stay cool in summer, but protected from deep freezing in winter. The floor itself was made from split logs, puncheons laid flat side up over thick support beams. This created an actual wood floor, much warmer underfoot than packed earth and providing better insulation from the cold below. The second major change involved the walls. Fletcher built the main structure with large, carefully fitted logs, each one debarked and hewn flat on top and bottom where they contacted each other. This was more work than using round logs, but it created much tighter joints with fewer gaps to chink. But he didn't stop there. For the north and west walls, the sides that faced prevailing winter winds, Fletcher built a second wall 2 feet inside the main wall. This inner wall was made from smaller logs, also hewn flat. The 2-foot gap between the walls was filled with a mixture of materials. Dried moss at the bottom, then a thick layer of dry leaves and forest duff, more moss, then a final layer of clay mixed with grass. The idea was to create multiple layers of trapped air and insulating material. The east and south walls didn't get the full double wall treatment because they faced the winter sun and less severe weather. But Fletcher chinked these walls much more carefully than his first cabin, using a specific recipe he had developed. The base layer was small split wood pieces, wedged tightly into gaps. Over this went a mixture of clay, sand, and cow hair he had traded for a bag of hair trimmings from a settler's ranch down valley. The hair reinforced the clay, preventing cracks. The sand added structure. The clay provided the seal. But Fletcher added one more element to his chinking recipe: lime. He had learned from another trapper that mixing a small amount of lime into clay chinking made it more resistant to water damage and cracking. The lime created a mild chemical reaction that hardened the mixture and made it more durable. Fletcher didn't understand the chemistry, but he understood results. The third major change was the fireplace and chimney. Instead of building against the outer wall, Fletcher positioned his fireplace in the interior about 4 feet from the north wall. He built the firebox and hearth from carefully selected stones, flat ones for the firebox floor, rounded river stones for the upper structure. But the key feature was the mass. Fletcher built the fireplace structure much larger than strictly necessary for the firebox itself. The stone chimney was thick and wide, creating significant thermal mass inside the cabin. He extended stone benches out from each side of the fireplace, creating places to sit that also served as additional heat-storing mass. The entire structure probably weighed 4 or 5 tons of stone, all positioned in the interior of the cabin, where its stored heat would radiate into the living space. The design principle was straightforward: fire a hot blaze for an hour or two, heating all that stone. The stone absorbed the heat, then slowly released it over the next 8 to 10 hours. This meant Fletcher could let the fire die down to coals or even go out completely, and the cabin would stay warm from the radiant heat of the stone mass. He had effectively built a battery for warmth, charging it up periodically rather than maintaining a constant fire. The chimney itself incorporated another feature Fletcher had been thinking about since Bergstrom's visit. He built it with a slight bend about 5 feet up from the firebox. This created a baffle for rising smoke and heat, forcing it to interact with more stone surface before exiting. The result was better heat extraction from the smoke and less warm air escaping up the chimney. But Fletcher went further. He designed what would become known as a split-flue system, though he didn't call it that. He created a secondary channel in the chimney that drew cold air from near the floor, preheated it as it passed alongside the main flue, then fed this warmed air into the firebox. The principle was simple. Cold air entering the fire was already partially warmed, making combustion more efficient and reducing the amount of cold air being pulled into the cabin from gaps around doors and windows. The system required careful stonework. The 2 flues had to be separated, but close enough to allow heat transfer. The intake opening had to be positioned low, where the coldest air pooled. The junction, where preheated air entered the firebox, had to create proper draft without smoke backup. Fletcher spent 3 weeks on the fireplace and chimney alone. Other trappers passing through the valley watched his progress with skepticism. The massive interior fireplace looked strange compared to standard end-wall placement. The split-flue design seemed overly complicated. But Fletcher kept working. He had lived through one inadequate winter. He wasn't going to repeat that mistake. The roof construction followed similar principles of insulation and durability. Most trappers' cabins had simple roofs, poles laid across walls, covered with bark or sod. They leaked during heavy rain. They provided minimal insulation. Fletcher built a roof that would last decades. He started with thick ridge poles spanning the width of the cabin. These weren't random branches. They were carefully selected logs 8 inches in diameter, notched to sit securely on the top wall logs. He spaced them 18 inches apart, closer than standard construction. Across these, he laid split planks hewn flat on one side. The planks overlapped like shingles, each layer covering gaps in the layer below. He pegged each plank to the ridge poles using wooden pegs he had whittled during evening hours. Over the planks, he laid birch bark in multiple overlapping layers. Birch bark was waterproof and flexible. Over the bark, he spread his clay-lime mixture, creating a layer that sealed every potential leak point. Finally, over the entire roof, he laid sod, living grass and soil that would root and create a living roof. The multiple layers made the roof incredibly heavy, but the robust wall construction supported the weight easily. The result was a roof that was waterproof, fire-resistant from sparks, insulated against temperature extremes, and strong. The fourth major element addressed ventilation and seasonal adaptation. Fletcher built small openings near the roofline on opposite walls, east and west. In winter, these stayed closed with fitted wood plugs sealed with clay. In summer, he removed the plugs, allowing hot air to rise out of the cabin naturally. This created airflow that made summer temperatures bearable. The fifth element involved windows and the south wall. Fletcher built his cabin with the main door and 2 windows on the south side, facing the winter sun. The windows were small, glass was expensive and fragile, but positioned to let in maximum light during the low sun angle of winter. In summer, when the sun was high in the sky, Wooden awnings over these windows provided shade, preventing the interior from overheating. Inside, Fletcher positioned a stone slab beneath each window. These slabs, about 3 inches thick and extending several feet into the room, absorbed winter sunlight during the day. As the sun warmed them, they stored that heat and released it through the evening and night. This passive solar heating, combined with the thermal mass of the fireplace, meant Fletcher needed much less firewood to maintain comfort. By early September, he had finished enough of the structure to move in. He spent the next few weeks completing details and fine-tuning the chinking. The first real test was coming. The first cold snap hit in October, dropping nighttime temperatures below zero. Fletcher lit his fireplace in the afternoon, building a hot fire that ran for about 2 hours. The stone mass heated up, radiating warmth throughout the cabin. By evening, when the fire had died down to coals, the interior temperature was noticeably comfortable, warm enough that Fletcher didn't need his heavy coat, something that had never been true in his old cabin. He let the fire go completely out around midnight and went to sleep. When he woke at dawn, his breath still formed mist, but the cabin was nowhere near as cold as it should have been. The stone fireplace was still warm to the touch. The walls showed no frost on the interior. The temperature had dropped, certainly, but much more gradually than in his old structure. Fletcher relit the fire. Within 30 minutes, the cabin was warm again. The split-flue system worked as designed. Cold air from the floor level was drawn into the intake channel, warmed as it passed alongside the main flue, then fed into the firebox already heated. This preheated combustion air made the fire burn hotter and more efficiently. Less smoke backed into the cabin. The draft was steady and strong. Over the next few weeks, Fletcher kept careful notes. He recorded how long fires burned, how much wood he used, how long the stone mass stayed warm. The results were striking. In his first cabin, he had burned approximately 4 cords of wood per month during deep winter, 24 cords for a 6-month heating season. That represented roughly 24 days of dangerous, exhausting labor cutting and hauling. With his new cabin and split-flue system, Fletcher burned approximately 1.5 cords per month, 9 cords for the same 6-month period, a 75% reduction in fuel consumption. That 15-day difference could be spent trapping, processing pelts, maintaining equipment, or simply resting. The fuel efficiency also meant less pressure on local forests. Fletcher didn't have to range as far to find adequate timber. Word began to spread. Other trappers passing through the valley noticed smoke rising cleanly from Fletcher's chimney. They saw his modest woodpile compared to their own rapidly diminishing stores. Some stopped to ask questions. Fletcher shared his techniques freely. He explained the split-flue principle, the importance of thermal mass, the value of proper insulation. He walked visitors through his cabin, pointing out specific features. Some trappers listened carefully. Others nodded politely, but remained skeptical. The amount of work Fletcher had invested seemed excessive for the benefit gained. But as winter deepened, that calculation would shift. By the spring of 1837, several trappers had visited Fletcher's cabin during the winter months. They had felt the warmth, seen the clean burning fire, noted the modest fuel consumption. When they returned to their own cold, smoke-filled cabins, the contrast was impossible to ignore. That summer, 2 trappers began incorporating elements of Fletcher's design into new cabins. Neither replicated his system exactly. Materials and circumstances varied, but both built interior fireplaces with increased thermal mass. Both experimented with improved chinking recipes. By 1838, variations of the split-flue chimney appeared in cabins throughout the valley. A French-Canadian trapper named Remy built a hybrid structure with double walls only on the north side, saving work while still getting significant insulation benefits. A pair of brothers from Kentucky built their fireplace dead center in their cabin, creating a stone mass so large it stayed warm for over 24 hours after the fire went out. An older trapper named Samuels modified his existing cabin, adding a stone collar around his chimney base to create thermal mass. He reported that this single change reduced his fuel consumption by roughly 1/3. The technique spread through informal knowledge exchange. Trappers met during supply runs or chance encounters on trap lines. They discussed what worked and what didn't. They debated the merits of different approaches. Fletcher became known as the man who had figured out how to build for the mountains, but he never claimed special insight or demanded recognition. He had simply observed, learned from others, experimented, and shared results. The split-flue principle proved particularly valuable. The preheated combustion air improved draft, reduced smoke backup, and increased burning efficiency. But the system required careful construction. The intake and exhaust flues had to be properly separated and sized. The junction point needed precise positioning. Several trappers who attempted split-flue designs without understanding the underlying principles ended up with chimneys that didn't draft properly or that leaked smoke into cabins. Fletcher helped troubleshoot these failures when he could, explaining the importance of proper channel dimensions and smooth interior surfaces. By late 1838, roughly a dozen cabins in the Wind River Valley region featured some version of Fletcher's innovations. The specific combinations varied. Not every cabin had double walls or split-flue chimneys, but the underlying principles of thermal mass, proper insulation, and efficient heat retention had taken hold. The transformation wasn't just technical. It represented a shift in how trappers thought about shelter. Instead of accepting cold and smoke as inevitable aspects of mountain life, they began treating cabin design as a problem that could be solved through careful observation and systematic improvement. Fletcher's quiet revolution had changed expectations. The winter of 1839 through 1840 tested every structure in the valley. A blizzard hit in mid-January, dumping 3 feet of snow in 2 days. The temperature plunged to 30 degrees below zero and stayed there for a week. Wind screamed through the valley at sustained speeds that made standing upright difficult. In standard cabins, the cold penetrated despite roaring fires. Trappers burned wood at rates that depleted supplies, meant to last weeks. Smoke backed up as chimneys struggled against fierce winds. Frost formed on interior walls. Water buckets froze solid 3 feet from hearths. In Fletcher's cabin, the conditions were different. The double walls on the north and west sides blocked wind penetration. The thick insulation trapped heat inside. The massive stone fireplace, charged with a hot fire each afternoon, radiated warmth through the night. Fletcher burned approximately 1 cord of wood that entire month, the same amount his neighbors burned in a week. The split-flue chimney maintained steady draft even in high winds. The preheated combustion air kept the fire burning clean and hot. Smoke rose smoothly up the flue without backing into the cabin. The temperature inside stayed stable, not warm by modern standards, but comfortable enough that Fletcher could work on equipment repairs without gloves. He could sleep without piling on every blanket he owned. The contrast with nearby cabins was stark. William Crawford, whose claim adjoined Fletcher's to the south, struggled through that week. His standard single-wall cabin with end-mounted fireplace offered minimal protection. Wind found every gap in the chinking. The fireplace radiated half its heat to the exterior wall. Crawford and his wife huddled near the hearth for 7 straight days, burning everything combustible they could find. They survived, but barely. When the storm finally broke, Crawford dug out his door and looked across the snow-covered landscape toward Fletcher's cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, steady and undisturbed. The structure showed no damage. Crawford thought about the 7 days he had just endured, the cold that penetrated despite the fire, the wind that found every crack, the certainty at certain moments that they wouldn't make it. Then he thought about Fletcher in that thick-walled cabin with its massive interior fireplace and split-flue chimney. He understood now why Fletcher had spent an entire summer on construction that seemed excessive. The waste of time and effort had become the margin of survival. By late February, 3 more trappers visited Fletcher's cabin to ask detailed questions about construction methods. They took notes. They made sketches on birch bark. They measured dimensions and asked about material sources. The mockery had ended. The education had begun. As winter turned to spring, the transformation in the valley became visible. Crawford began rebuilding his cabin in April. He consulted with Fletcher on every aspect of the design. The new structure featured double walls on the north side, an interior fireplace with significantly increased thermal mass, and improved chinking using Fletcher's clay sand lime recipe. The Split-Flue Chimney took Crawford 2 weeks to build. Fletcher helped with the tricky junction where the intake channel met the main flue. The stonework required precision. Gaps that were too large reduced efficiency. Gaps that were too small created smoke problems. By June, Crawford's new cabin was complete. It was smaller than Fletcher's. Resources and time limited the scope, but it incorporated the key principles. That summer, 2 more cabins went up in the valley, both designed with thermal mass and insulation as primary considerations. A trapper named Peter Morrison built his fireplace in the center of a single room, surrounding it with stone benches that served as both seating and heat storage. The entire structure weighed perhaps 3 tons. Brothers from Ohio, named James and Robert Hendricks, built with double walls on 3 sides, leaving only the south wall as single thickness. They calculated that this gave them most of the insulation benefit while reducing construction time by roughly 1/3. The summer of 1840 also brought new settlers to the valley, families claiming land under various programs and incentives. These settlers arrived with Eastern building methods and little understanding of mountain conditions. Fletcher and other experienced trappers shared their knowledge freely. They explained why interior fireplaces mattered. They demonstrated proper chinking techniques. They described the value of thermal mass and insulation. Some new settlers listened. They invested the extra time to build properly, following principles that trappers had developed through hard experience. Others dismissed the advice. They built quickly using familiar methods, confident that a standard cabin adequate in Ohio or Pennsylvania would work fine in Wyoming. The coming winter would sort these 2 groups. By late summer, approximately 8 cabins in the valley region featured split-flue chimneys or variations thereof. Perhaps a dozen more had incorporated improved thermal mass without the full split-flue system. And most cabins built that year used Fletcher's chinking recipe, which had proven more durable than traditional clay and moss approaches. The transformation represented more than technical improvement. It showed how frontier communities functioned at their best, knowledge shared freely, innovations tested and refined, practical solutions spreading through informal networks of people who faced common challenges. Fletcher never asked for payment or recognition. He answered questions. He helped troubleshoot problems. He demonstrated techniques to anyone interested. The survival of his neighbors increased his own safety. Isolated trappers faced enough dangers without adding preventable, suffering from inadequate shelter. By 1843, the changes in the valley were comprehensive. Of approximately 25 cabins within a 10-mile radius of Fletcher's original claim, 19 featured some combination of his design innovations. The specific implementations varied based on builder skill, available materials, and individual circumstances. But the underlying principles, thermal mass, effective insulation, efficient combustion, had become standard practice. The fuel consumption statistics told the story. Valley-wide, firewood usage during winter months had dropped by an estimated 40 to 50% compared to 5 years earlier. This represented hundreds of person-days of labor saved annually, time that trappers and settlers could redirect toward productive work or necessary rest. The health impacts were harder to quantify, but equally real. Warmer cabins with better ventilation reduced respiratory illnesses. Stable interior temperatures decreased cold-related stress on bodies. Smoke-free living spaces eliminated constant exposure to irritants. Mortality data from the period is incomplete, but written accounts from travelers passing through the valley in the early 1840s consistently noted the quality of cabin construction and the relative comfort of trappers compared to other regions. The fur trade itself was collapsing by this time. Beaver populations had been trapped out in many areas. More significantly, silk had replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying demand for the pelts that had driven the MountainMen era. Trappers began leaving the mountains, heading to Oregon, California, or back to settled areas. But the cabins remained. Settlers moving west discovered abandoned structures built with Fletcher's principles. They recognized superior construction. Some were occupied and maintained by new inhabitants. Others served as way stations for travelers. The knowledge continued spreading. A group of trappers who had wintered in the valley in 1839 built cabins in Montana Territory in 1842, incorporating split-flue designs. Settlers heading to Oregon country sometimes stopped in the Wind River Valley and received advice on cabin building. The dispersal was gradual, informal, but effective. Fletcher himself stayed in the valley until 1843. The fur trade was dying, but he had come to love the mountains and the valley where he had learned his hard lessons. He eventually married a Shoshone woman, Morning Crow's cousin, and they raised 3 children in that carefully built cabin. He made his living guiding settlers through mountain passes, using knowledge gained during his trapping years. The cabin itself stood for over 40 years. It survived countless winter storms, summer heat waves, and the wear of daily use. When Fletcher finally abandoned it in the 1860s to move closer to one of his grown children, the structure was still solid. Logs, intact, chinking holding firm, stone fireplace as sound as the day he built it. Other settlers used it for years afterward, recognizing the quality of its construction. The techniques Fletcher developed weren't revolutionary in the sense of being entirely new. Double wall construction, interior thermal mass, proper chinking, efficient combustion. All these methods existed in various forms throughout different building traditions. What Fletcher did was combine them specifically for the extreme conditions of high-altitude mountain living, adapting knowledge from Scandinavian log building, indigenous construction methods, and practical carpentry. The real innovation was recognizing that a cabin didn't have to be just a box made of logs. It could be designed to work with natural heat flows, to store and release warmth strategically, to adapt to seasonal changes. This required understanding basic principles of heat transfer, radiation, conduction, and convection. Even if Fletcher never knew those formal terms, he understood them through observation and experience. As settlers continued arriving in the Rockies through the 1850s, they often found trappers' cabins with these features already incorporated. They adopted the techniques for their own construction. The specific methods continued evolving. Better chinking recipes, improved fireplace designs, more sophisticated ventilation systems, but the core principles remained. Regional variations developed based on local conditions and materials. In areas where stone was scarce, builders used adobe or thick-packed earth for thermal mass. Where timber was limited, they used smaller logs with thicker insulation layers. The underlying principles remained constant, but implementation adapted to circumstances. Modern thermal engineering would eventually explain why Fletcher's design worked so well. The double walls created insulation through trapped air and multiple material layers. The interior thermal mass acted as a thermal battery, storing energy when abundant and releasing it when needed. The split-flue system optimized combustion efficiency. The ventilation system allowed seasonal adaptation. Every element served a specific thermal purpose, whether Fletcher fully understood the physics or not. The impact extended beyond individual comfort. Better insulated cabins required less firewood, which meant less time spent in dangerous, exhausting work. This gave trappers and settlers more time for other activities. Reduced firewood use also meant less impact on local forests. Warmer, more comfortable cabins contributed to better health outcomes. Constant exposure to cold-stressed bodies and increased vulnerability to illness. Cabins that maintained stable temperatures reduced that stress. The social aspect deserves mention as well. By sharing his techniques freely, Fletcher contributed to a tradition of mutual aid that characterized mountain communities. Building a cabin that worked properly meant the difference between surviving winter and freezing. People shared survival knowledge because lives depended on it. Some of Fletcher's descendants continued living in the Rocky Mountain region for decades. His grandchildren told stories about the cabin their grandfather built, the one that stayed warm without burning mountains of firewood, the one with the massive stone fireplace and efficient chimney. The knowledge persisted in structures that worked and methods that succeeded. Fletcher's specific cabin eventually fell into disrepair after being abandoned in the 1860s. Weather and time took their toll. By the early 1900s, only the stone fireplace remained standing, a monument to the part of the structure built to truly last. Even that was eventually buried by shifting soil and vegetation. But the knowledge Fletcher developed and shared persisted long after the physical structure vanished. The transition from the trapping era to settled agriculture brought new approaches to building. Sawmills made dimensional lumber available. Manufactured materials provided new options. Better tools allowed more sophisticated construction. But many lessons from the trapping days remained relevant. Farmers and ranchers building permanent homes in the mountains still faced extreme temperature swings. They still needed structures that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. The fundamental principles of working with climate rather than fighting it continued to apply. Parts of Fletcher's cabin were preserved when it was finally dismantled in the 1950s. The main door sits in a regional museum. Several logs were saved and are displayed with explanation of construction techniques. The massive hearthstone marks the original site, where a historical marker explains the story. Modern visitors to historic sites sometimes see reconstructed trappers' cabins that fail to capture the sophistication of the better-built examples. Simple log boxes with end-mounted fireplaces make for authentic-looking displays. But they don't represent the evolved designs that mountain men actually built once they had learned through hard experience. The difference between a first-year trapper's cabin and the structure he built after 5 mountain winters was dramatic. The story highlights something important about innovation in frontier settings. Major breakthroughs didn't always come from professional builders or trained engineers. Sometimes the most valuable innovations came from observant people willing to learn from mistakes, listen to diverse knowledge sources, and experiment until they found better solutions. Fletcher's combination of Swedish building principles, indigenous construction knowledge, and practical carpentry created something more effective than any single tradition alone. The fundamental lesson remains relevant. Buildings can be designed to work with their environment rather than simply resisting it. Understanding how heat moves, how materials behave, how seasons change. These principles enable creating structures that are more comfortable, more efficient, and more sustainable. Fletcher learned these lessons the hard way, freezing through a Rocky Mountain winter in a poorly built cabin. His willingness to observe, experiment, learn from others, and share what he discovered created knowledge that spread through mountain communities and influenced frontier building for generations. His cabin, that carefully built structure with its double walls and split-flue chimney, is long gone. But the understanding it represented survived, built into the logs and stones of cabins scattered across the Rockies, standing as testament to practical minds working with available materials and the determination to endure. What choice would you have made on that day, speed or survival? Share your thoughts in the comments. Practical stories keep this history alive.